Summer 1940. RAF Hurricane pilots were dying at twice the rate of their German counterparts, not from lack of courage or skill, but from a brutal mathematical reality. Their guns were effective at 400 yards, whilst enemy armour remained impenetrable beyond that range. Standard 8-gun armament riddled targets with holes that did nothing. Then a factory engineer from Birmingham proposed something so absurdly simple that Air Ministry officials laughed him out of the room. They called his design stupid. 6 months later, Luftwaffe intelligence would desperately try to understand why their bombers were suddenly exploding in mid-air at distances previously considered safe. 21st August 1940, 14:47 hours, RAF Biggin Hill, Kent. The smell of burning aviation fuel hung thick over the dispersal hut as squadron leader James Thornton watched another Hurricane limp back to base, fabric shredded, coolant streaming from a dozen puncture wounds. The aircraft had fired over 2,400 rounds into a Heinkel He-111 at close range. The bomber had continued flying for another 12 minutes before finally ditching in the channel, crew intact. This was the third such incident that week. The mathematics were becoming impossible to ignore. RAF Fighter Command's standard armament, 8-303 Browning machine guns, was designed on a pre-war doctrine that assumed fabric-covered biplanes as adversaries. The German bombers arriving over Britain were different beasts entirely. All-metal construction, self-sealing fuel tanks, armoured crew positions, redundant systems. British pilots were closing to suicidal ranges of 200 yards or less, desperately trying to inflict damage that their weapons simply couldn't deliver at safer distances. The casualty statistics told a grim story. In the first month of sustained operations, Fighter Command lost 126 pilots killed or missing. German losses, 63. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Britain had perhaps 2,900 trained fighter pilots. Germany had over 4,500, with training schools producing replacements at twice the British rate. At precisely 09:15 on 23rd August, a Morris truck arrived at RAF Northolt, carrying something that would initially be dismissed as the desperate fantasy of a man who knew nothing about aerial warfare. His name was Arthur Webb, 51 years old, senior foreman at the Birmingham Small Arms Company factory in Shirley. He had never flown in an aeroplane. He had never fired a machine gun. What he understood, with the intimate knowledge of a man who had spent 32 years on factory floors, was metallurgy, ballistics, and the precise tolerances required to make things work when theory said they shouldn't. Webb had spent the previous 6 weeks doing something that Air Ministry regulations technically forbade, conducting private experiments with ammunition that violated every specification in the official handbook. The problem, as Webb saw it, was elegant in its simplicity. Standard 303 ball ammunition was designed to penetrate fabric and wood. Against quarter-inch aluminium alloy backed by structural frames, it performed like throwing pebbles at a dustbin. Lots of noise, minimal damage. The armor-piercing rounds available were better, but their solid construction meant they punched neat holes through sheet metal without transferring sufficient energy to cause catastrophic structural failure. What was needed, Webb believed, was something that would do what artillery shells did: explode. The RAF already possessed incendiary and tracer rounds, but these were designed to ignite fuel, not destroy structure. Webb's proposal was different. A shell that would penetrate the target's skin, then detonate inside the airframe, converting the bomber's own structure into shrapnel that would tear through control cables, hydraulic lines, oxygen systems, and crew. He called it a high-explosive incendiary round, though the technical description hardly captured what it actually did. The Air Ministry's initial response was documented in a memorandum dated 26th of August. Mr. Webb's proposed ammunition violates the established principles of anti-aircraft ballistics. The .303 caliber is insufficient to contain meaningful explosive payload. The proposed fusing mechanism cannot function reliably at machine gun velocities. The concept is rejected. The rejection was signed by 3 separate departments: Squadron leader Thornton, however, had read the casualty lists. He had watched pilots die because they had to press attacks to point-blank range. He had personally written letters to 17 widows in the past month. When Webb's proposal crossed his desk via an informal channel, a factory supervisor who happened to be Thornton's cousin, he made a decision that would later be described as either brilliant initiative or insubordination, depending on which officer was asked. He authorized Webb to produce 500 rounds for field testing. Webb returned to Birmingham on 27 August with something he hadn't possessed before, official-looking paperwork that would allow him to requisition materials, even if the paperwork's authority was questionable at best. The development work began in a corner of the BSA factory designated for experimental ordnance, which in practice meant a space behind the main production lines, where components that failed quality control were normally stored. Webb assembled a team of 6, 2 toolmakers, 1 chemist, 1 fusing specialist seconded from a nearby artillery workshop, and 2 machinists who understood that silence about their activities was not optional. The technical challenge was formidable. The 303 round was 7.9 in diameter and 56 in length. Webb needed to fit an explosive charge, a fusing mechanism, and an incendiary compound inside a package barely larger than a man's thumb, whilst maintaining the ballistic characteristics that would allow it to chamber, fire, and fly accurately. Standard explosive compounds were too insensitive to detonate from the impact forces involved. More sensitive compounds risked detonating in the gun barrel, killing the pilot. The fusing mechanism needed to arm itself during flight, but remain safe during handling, storage, and the violent acceleration of firing. Webb's solution was later described as elegant by ordnance experts, once they stopped calling it impossible. The shell casing was aluminium alloy, not brass, saving weight. The explosive charge was a mixture of RDX and aluminium powder, similar to what the Royal Navy used in torpedo warheads, but in quantities measured in grains rather than pounds. The fuse was impact-triggered, but required the centrifugal force of barrel rifling to arm it. Elegant, simple, and theoretically functional. Theory, however, had a limited success rate when applied to high-explosive ordnance. The first test round, fired on 4 September at a private range in the Warwickshire countryside, detonated in the barrel, destroying a test rifle and leaving Webb temporarily deaf in his left ear. The second test, conducted 3 days later with revised fusing, fired successfully but failed to detonate on impact. The third test detonated, but prematurely, at 600 yards instead of on target. By 12 September, Webb had conducted 19 tests, 14 complete failures, 3 partial successes, 2 results that could be called functional. It was not the success rate that peacetime engineering would tolerate. But Britain was no longer at peace, and the Luftwaffe was burning London. 17th September 1940, 06:30 hours, BSA Factory, Birmingham. The air raid siren wailed its familiar dirge across Birmingham's industrial heart as Arthur Webb watched his 3rd production line in a week get dismantled and moved to the factory's reinforced basement. The Luftwaffe had discovered that Britain's aircraft and munitions factories made excellent targets. Last night's raid had destroyed 2 warehouses at the Austin Motor Works 3 miles south. The week before, a parachute mine had obliterated an entire street of worker housing in Aston. Webb's experimental ammunition project was now racing against 2 separate deadlines: the technical challenge of making the rounds work reliably and the existential threat that a single well-placed bomb could erase his entire effort. The production environment was brutally constrained. Electricity was rationed to 8 hours daily, forcing work into split shifts that operated whenever power was available. Sometimes 03 Zara to 11 say, sometimes midnight to dawn. The factory's machine tools, designed for precision work, now operated in a basement with temperature swings of 15 degrees and humidity that corroded everything. Raw materials were a constant crisis. Aluminium alloy for shell casings was allocated by central planning, with aircraft production receiving absolute priority. Webb had to cannibalize rejected aircraft components, melting down parts that failed quality inspection to obtain metal for shells. The RDX explosive came from a chemical works in Widnes that was itself operating under partial bomb damage, with delivery schedules that meant sometime this month if the roads aren't cratered. The workforce was exhausted. Britain's factory workers were pulling 60-hour weeks as standard, 72 during periods of urgent need. Webb's team was doing both their regular production shifts and the experimental work. Sleep averaged 4 to 5 hours nightly. Food was rationed, 1 egg per week, 4 ounces of bacon, 2 ounces of tea. The factory canteen served meals that were technically nutritious but uniformly grey. And yet, they worked. Webb's team now numbered 14, expanded by necessity rather than plan. The work required specialists, toolmakers who could fabricate components to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, chemists who understood explosive chemistry well enough to work safely in cramped conditions, fusing technicians who could assemble mechanisms the size of a pencil eraser that needed to function flawlessly at velocities exceeding 2,400 feet per second. The technical evolution of the round was documented in notebooks that Webb kept in a locked drawer, filled with diagrams, measurements, and notations like detonator compound 17J, too sensitive, reject, and fuse spring tension reduced to 3.2 Oz, successful test. By 24th September, the team had identified the core problems and their solutions. Problem 1, premature detonation. The fuse was arming too early during flight, causing detonation before impact. Solution: add a centrifugal delay mechanism that required 3 full rotations after barrel exit before arming. This bought an additional 0.09 seconds, enough to ensure the round was clear of the aircraft before becoming active. Problem 2, explosive compound sensitivity. Too sensitive, and it detonated from firing shock. Too insensitive, and it failed to detonate on impact. Solution: a 2-stage compound with a sensitive initiator charge of 0.4 grains and a less sensitive main charge of 8 grains. The initiator would trigger from impact. The main charge would then detonate sympathetically. Problem 3, ballistic consistency. Early rounds tumbled in flight, making accurate shooting impossible. Solution: precise weight distribution and a slightly longer shell profile that stabilized in the weapon's rifling. The testing regime was relentless. Every batch of 100 rounds underwent proof testing, 20 rounds fired for velocity verification, 10 for accuracy at 400 yards, 5 for detonation reliability. The remaining 65 were delivered to RAF stations for field trials. The first field trials occurred on 29th September at RAF Duxford. Squadron leader Douglas Bader's squadron received 200 rounds, 16 shells per aircraft, loaded mixed with standard ammunition. The pilots were skeptical. Bader himself called the shells Webb's Stupids after reading the technical description, a nickname that would persist despite later success. The first operational use occurred on 2nd October during an engagement with Heinkel He 111 bombers over Kent. Flight Lieutenant Peter Matthews, flying Hurricane V7359, opened fire at 800 yards, double the normal effective range, on a Heinkel that was attempting to run for the Channel coast. Standard doctrine said this was a waste of ammunition. Matthews, who had been briefed on the new rounds, held his aim point steady and fired a 2-second burst. 48 rounds, 16 of them Webb's high-explosive incendiaries. The Heinkel's port wing root exploded, not burned, exploded. The structural frame shattered, the wings separated at the fuselage junction, and the aircraft entered an inverted spin from which it did not recover. Impact with the Channel occurred 23 seconds later. Matthews's combat report, filed that evening, used the word unbelievable 3 times. Within a week, every Hurricane squadron in Fighter Command was requesting the new ammunition. Webb's production challenge immediately escalated from proving the concept to mass production under conditions that made mass production nearly impossible. The Air Ministry now wanted 250,000 rounds per week. Webb's basement operation could produce 4,000 per week on a good week. Scaling up required machinery that didn't exist, trained workers who didn't exist, and factory space that wasn't being bombed. Webb's solution was characteristic of British wartime improvisation. He distributed the production across 17 separate locations, small machine shops, tool-making firms, even a jewellery workshop in Hockley that specialised in precision work. Each location produced one component. The shell casings came from Birmingham. The explosive compound was mixed in Widnes. The fuses were assembled in Coventry. The final assembly occurred in 3 separate underground facilities that had previously been coal storage bunkers. By 20th October, production reached 31,000 rounds per week. By 15th November, it hit 89,000. The quality control failure rate remained stubbornly at 7%, meaning that 1 in 14 rounds either failed to detonate or detonated prematurely. But this was considered acceptable given that standard ammunition had a 100% failure rate at causing catastrophic damage. The human cost of this production surge was measurable. Workers were collapsing from exhaustion. Industrial accidents increased by 34% as fatigue eroded concentration. The Coventry Fuse Assembly Facility took a direct hit during the massive raid of 14th of November, killing 11 workers and destroying 3 weeks of production inventory. Webb himself was hospitalized briefly on 18th of November with what doctors called nervous exhaustion, but which was actually 3 weeks of operating on 2 hours of sleep per night, whilst managing a production network spread across 30 miles of industrial Midlands. He was back at work 4 days later because no one else fully understood the entire production chain. The technical success, however, was undeniable. Pilots who had previously needed to close to 200 yards, a range where enemy defensive fire was murderously effective, were now engaging successfully at 600 to 800 yards. The Hurricane's 8-gun armament, previously criticized as inadequate, became devastating when even a handful of rounds could cause structural failure. The Luftwaffe began reporting an alarming increase in catastrophic bomber losses. Aircraft that didn't just catch fire or sustain damage, but literally came apart in mid-air from what appeared to be single hits. German intelligence was about to become very confused. 3rd November 1940, Luftwaffe Intelligence Section occupied France. Hauptmann Klaus Richter stared at the intelligence report with the expression of a man watching his certainties dissolve. The document, compiled from debriefings of returning bomber crews and analysis of wreckage, described a phenomenon that violated everything German ordnance theory said should be possible. British Hurricane fighters were destroying German bombers with single bursts at ranges exceeding 700 meters. The damage pattern suggested explosive ammunition, but 303 machine gun rounds could not contain meaningful explosive payloads. It was physically impossible. The caliber was too small, the velocities too high, the fusing mechanisms too complex to miniaturize. And yet, the evidence was overwhelming. In the first week of October, Luftwaffe bomber losses had increased by 43%. Whilst fighter losses remained essentially unchanged. This suggested that the British had made some advancement specifically in bomber destruction capability. In the second week, the pattern intensified, 51% increase. By the end of October, the loss rate had nearly doubled compared to September. More disturbing than the numbers was the qualitative change. Previously, German bombers hit by British fire would return to base with damage that was extensive but survivable. Punctured fuel tanks, damaged control surfaces, wounded crew. Now bombers were simply exploding. Wings separating from fuselages, tail sections disintegrating, structural failures that looked like anti-aircraft artillery hits. Except they were occurring at altitudes where flak couldn't reach and from angles consistent with fighter attack. Richter's first theory, that the British had developed 20mm cannon ammunition for the Hurricane was eliminated immediately. Wreckage analysis showed 303 caliber impact points. His second theory, that British fighters were now carrying bombs or rockets for air-to-air use, was equally impossible. No German pilot reported seeing such weapons. The truth was buried in a single recovered projectile, found embedded in the fuselage of a Dornier Do-17 that had crash-landed near Calais on 28th of October. The round had penetrated the skin but failed to detonate. German ordnance technicians carefully sectioned it and discovered something that should not exist: a miniature explosive charge with an impact fuse, packaged inside a .303 shell casing. The technical analysis that followed was both grudging admiration and professional outrage. The design was crude by German engineering standards, tolerances that would never pass Luftwaffe inspection, an explosive charge measured in grams rather than anything substantial, a fusing mechanism that looked like it had been assembled in a garage workshop. And yet it worked. The explosive charge, whilst small, was positioned perfectly to maximize structural damage. The fuse was simple but reliable. The whole design reflected an approach that prioritized functionality over theoretical elegance, exactly the sort of improvised solution that German military doctrine considered inferior. Richter's report to Luftwaffe High Command, dated 8th of November, was diplomatically worded but conveyed a disturbing reality. The enemy has developed an effective countermeasure to our bomber formations that our current defensive tactics cannot adequately address. Recommendation: increase fighter escort, reduce bomber formation altitude, expedite development of equivalent ordnance for our own fighters. The response from Berlin was bureaucratic. Proposal under review. Continue current operations. The Luftwaffe's institutional structure was not designed for rapid adaptation. The German military machine operated on carefully planned doctrines, centralized decision-making, and rigid hierarchies. When a squadron commander in France requested permission to modify defensive tactics, the approval process involved 4 separate headquarters and required written justification that wouldn't be reviewed for 3 weeks. The British, by contrast, were updating tactics weekly based on pilot feedback from the previous weekend's combat. German bomber crews, meanwhile, were experiencing something they hadn't felt since the campaign began: fear. The previous calculus, that British fighters were dangerous but manageable, that defensive formations and return fire would protect them, had evaporated. Now, every encounter with Hurricanes carried the possibility of instant structural failure. Luftwaffe bomber pilots began reporting increased stress, deteriorating morale, and a growing reluctance to press attacks when British fighters appeared. The psychological impact was measurable. Bombing accuracy decreased by 26% in November compared to September, not because of increased anti-aircraft fire or weather conditions, but because crews were breaking off attacks earlier and flying evasively rather than maintaining steady bombing runs. On 15th of November, a Heinkel He-111 crew refused to fly their assigned mission, citing inadequate fighter protection. This was the first instance of combat refusal in the Luftwaffe's bomber force during the Battle of Britain. The crew was court-martialed, but the incident reflected a broader crisis of confidence. German fighter pilots, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109s and 110s, were not experiencing the same technical disadvantage. Their aircraft weren't being hit by the explosive rounds with the same frequency. The British appeared to be prioritizing bombers, which made tactical sense. But the fighter pilots could see what was happening to their charges. Entire bomber formations were being decimated, whilst the fighters, limited by fuel range and unable to stay with the bombers throughout their missions, could only watch. The most significant German response came not from tactical adaptation, but from strategic revision. On 12th November, Hitler postponed Operation Celion, the invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The official reason was unsuitable weather conditions and ongoing preparations. The unstated reason, evident in intercepted communications that British intelligence would decode weeks later, was that air superiority had not been achieved and showed no signs of being achievable. The Luftwaffe had been told to destroy Fighter Command. Instead, Fighter Command was destroying the Luftwaffe's bomber force at an unsustainable rate. By the end of November, the Blitz shifted from daylight strategic bombing to nighttime raids. The official German narrative described this as a tactical evolution. The reality was simpler. German bombers could not survive in British skies during daylight hours. A single British factory worker's stupid shell had helped force the most powerful air force in the world to abandon daylight operations. German engineers would eventually develop their own explosive machine gun ammunition. By mid-1941, the Luftwaffe fielded the Minengeschoss round, a 20 mm explosive shell that was technically superior to Webb's design. But by then, the critical window had closed. The Battle of Britain was over. Britain had not been invaded. The RAF had survived. And Arthur Webb's improvised ordnance had played a role that would remain classified for another 3 decades. 15th May 1945, Birmingham Arthur Webb stood in the BSA factory's main production hall, now silent for the first time in 6 years. The machinery that had run continuously through the war, through bombing raids, through rationing, through the grinding exhaustion that had killed some workers as surely as any enemy action, was finally still. The numbers, when compiled, told a story that Webb himself found difficult to comprehend. Between September 1940 and March 1945, British factories had produced approximately 497 million rounds of 303 ammunition. Of those, 62 million were high-explosive incendiary rounds based on Webb's original design. They had been fired from Hurricanes, Spitfires, Beaufighters, Mosquitoes, and bomber defensive turrets. They had destroyed aircraft over Britain, France, Germany, North Africa, Italy, Burma, and the Pacific. The RAF's official assessment, delivered in a document that Webb received in July 1945, credited the ammunition with contributing to the destruction of approximately 3,400 enemy aircraft, a figure that represented rough attribution since most combat involved mixed ammunition loads. The document was marked secret, and Webb was instructed not to discuss the contents. The immediate military impact was clear enough from casualty statistics. In September 1940, Fighter Command's exchange rate against German bombers was approximately 1.91, nearly 2 British fighters lost for every German bomber destroyed. By December 1940, after widespread deployment of the explosive rounds, the ratio had reversed to approximately 3.2.1 in Britain's favour. The Luftwaffe's bomber force never recovered its September strength, but the legacy extended beyond statistics. Webb's design had proven something that British military procurement would remember, that innovation under pressure could come from unexpected sources, that formal engineering credentials mattered less than practical problem-solving, and that the rigid hierarchies of peacetime were luxuries that wartime could not afford. The ammunition's development had also established production methodologies that Britain would use throughout the war. The distributed manufacturing network, 17 separate facilities producing components that were then assembled elsewhere, became standard practice for critical munitions. When the Luftwaffe bombed Coventry's aircraft factories, production continued because the work had been dispersed. When Liverpool's shipyards were hit, destroyer construction continued in 12 smaller yards up and down the coast. Webb himself never sought recognition. He returned to his pre-war position as factory foreman, a role he held until retirement in 1954. His name appeared on no honours lists, received no medals, and was mentioned in no official histories until declassification in 1972. But those who had worked with him knew. When Webb died in 1968, his funeral in Birmingham was attended by 47 former RAF pilots. None of them had met him during the war. Most had only learned his name years later. They came because someone had quietly spread the word. This was the man whose ammunition had kept them alive when the mathematics said they should have died. The technical legacy was equally significant. Webb's design principles, miniaturization of explosive charges, impact fusing for high-velocity projectiles, distributed manufacturing under wartime constraints, influenced post-war ammunition development across NATO forces. The 20mm high explosive incendiary round that became standard on jet fighters in the 1950s traced its conceptual lineage directly to Webb's work. The psychological legacy was perhaps most important. The explosive rounds had given RAF pilots a weapon that worked at ranges where they could survive. The confidence that came from knowing that a 2-second burst could destroy a bomber rather than merely damage it translated into aggressiveness that German formations could not counter. British pilots pressed attacks because they believed they would succeed. That belief, as much as the technical capability, defined the battle's outcome. In 1982, a historian researching declassified RAF documents discovered Webb's original proposal letter, dated 23 August 1940. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, containing basic technical sketches and a single paragraph that read, "I believe this can be made to work. I believe it must be made to work. Our lads are dying because their guns aren't good enough. Give me a fortnight and some materials, and I'll show you something better." Below the letter, stamped in red ink, was the Air Ministry's initial response. Rejected. Impractical design. Someone, identity unknown, had subsequently added in pencil, "Rejected by idiots." Approved by someone with sense. Thank God. The full production and deployment records, when finally analyzed by historians, revealed the human cost behind the numbers. The distributed production network had employed approximately 2,800 workers at peak capacity. 41 of them died in bombing raids while at work. Another 73 died in raids on their homes. Industrial accidents killed 18 more. The production of 62 million rounds had cost 132 lives beyond those lost in combat. But those 62 million rounds had, by conservative estimate, saved the lives of at least 1,400 RAF pilots who would otherwise have been shot down pressing attacks to suicidal close range. They had preserved perhaps 900 aircraft that would otherwise have been lost. They had kept fighter command operational during the months when Britain stood alone. Webb's stupid shell had helped prevent an invasion that would have killed hundreds of thousands. The final recognition came in 1995, during the 55th anniversary commemoration of the Battle of Britain. The RAF Museum at Hendon unveiled a small exhibit, a cutaway display of a 303 high-explosive incendiary round, accompanied by a placard explaining its development and impact. The exhibit included a photograph of Arthur Webb, the only one known to exist, showing a balding man in factory overalls, squinting slightly at the camera, looking utterly unremarkable. The placard's final sentence read, "In warfare, brilliance sometimes wears overalls." Webb's grandson attended the unveiling. He brought with him the notebooks Webb had kept during the ammunition's development, 16 volumes of technical drawings, test results, and production notes. The museum acquired them for its archives, where they remain, testament to what one determined man could accomplish when the alternative was watching his nation's defenders die from inadequate weapons. The lesson was simple enough that it shouldn't have needed teaching. When survival is at stake, listen to the people who make things work, not just the people who theorize about them. Arthur Webb understood metal, explosives, and practical engineering. The Air Ministry understood regulations, procurement procedures, and theoretical ballistics. Webb's understanding saved lives. Theory could wait. In the final accounting, perhaps that's the real legacy of the stupid shell. It proved that ordinary people, given tools and trust, can accomplish extraordinary things. It validated the British conviction that class and credentials matter less than competence. It demonstrated that innovation thrives when hierarchy yields to urgency. And it showed that sometimes the stupidest idea in the room is only stupid until it wins the war. If this story of British ingenuity and determination resonated with you, I'd be tremendously grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. There are countless other untold stories from the war. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything was at stake. Leave a comment sharing which aspect of wartime innovation you'd like to explore next. Your support keeps these forgotten heroes' stories alive. Cheers, and thank you for watching.